my major, my foundation was finding commonalities to learn about folks, but you got to go beyond that. Because you might not necessarily find those commonalities, but how do you still learn and grow? And so part of my homework was leaning into how can we get to a place where we're asking questions and adapting and, understanding various folks from various backgrounds with curiosity and not just being stuck in that, well, how does it relate to me?
Welcome to Unpacked Culture Chronicles. I'm Danielle Marshall, an equity strategist and executive coach. This podcast explores the intersection of curiosity, culture, and connection with practical strategies to help us bridge divides and build stronger relationships. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Jo Xavier Doyle to the show. Jo and I have known each other for several years, and what I've always admired about them is their ability to turn everyday moments into opportunities for reflection and growth, whether through their work in racial justice and LGBTQ plus advocacy, or their deep commitment to supporting young people. Jo approaches life with curiosity that invites learning rather than fear of difference. In this conversation, we explore what it means to lean into curiosity, how we navigate identity in different cultural spaces, and the lessons we learn when we embrace discomfort. Jo also shares how their experiences growing up in a multiracial, multiethnic family and attending an international school shaped their approach to building inclusive communities. If you've ever wondered how to engage more deeply with difference without making it about yourself, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Let's dive in. Today, I'm excited to welcome Jo to the show. I have the pleasure of working with them in a few capacities. What I have really appreciated about Jo from our early days are the perspectives that they bring to the table and how they're able to find teachable moments everywhere, where they're able to share their noticing so that we can all learn together. I think that's a real gift. So Jo, welcome today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. It's always, I'm always so appreciative whenever I get a call from you saying, hey, can I, talk to you about something? And I'm like, sure, let's shoot the stuff.
I love that, Jo. I think you're an amazing thought partner. So I definitely feel the same way. So I just want to get us started. And I've been asking people to introduce themselves. And just for listeners, one of the reasons I do ask people to introduce themselves is I think it's really important for us to be able to voice our narrative in our own words, as opposed to just having someone read a bio. Anyone can read that. And I think it is really important for us to be able to tell the most important parts of our story. And so, Jo, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the listeners and just share a little bit more about your background.
Oh, okay. I kind of more or less say when I talk about myself, because it's always, I don't know, for me, it's a little hard to, say like, oh, here's who I am. And I grew up in Long Island, New York and Manhattan, New York for 25 years with an adoptive family who are predominantly white. I do have an adoptive brother, and then my two sisters are biological to my parents who have a background from, Ireland, the Europe and Russia. And so, just a very stark contrast to how we look with one another, and kind of that really shaped and I think for my parents actually told me this when I was older and really getting into the work that I was doing now, that they actually protected me intentionally from a lot of things around racial identity and prejudices. And I didn't really get that wake up call until much later in my life. I mean, sure, you have interactions, but I was really sheltered from those interactions until we moved into New York City. But because New York City was such a melting pot, and I was able to find folks who were alike and not alike, but there was just such a vastness of that in New York. And further, I got to have the privilege of going to the United Nations International School. So I was really surrounded with diversity at a very young age, starting at 10 years old. And that was quite an amazing experience that not a lot of people get to experience. So I really appreciated that. And it really had me lean into learning how to work with difference, but not being afraid of difference, and learning how to kind of lean into difference without the fear of difference. And I really appreciated that. And I think that really prompted me to want to travel the world and want to dive into the more or less the work that I'm doing now, which is social and racial justice work. and really centered around supporting youth. And so, I'm someone who started my career in education and kind of through that really created an understanding of how important just like positive human development is and what that looks like from a child developmental level, but then also kind of pivoting to, okay, well, what does that look like just as an overall, human developmental level and how we interact with ourselves and kind of seeing how those interactions might change or differ over time through age and experience. So I find that all really fascinating and why I love the work that I do and why I, really I would say specialize in this work specifically for young adults and younger people.
I'm really excited to dive into this conversation because what you're expressing right now is such a rich experience. You've had time to travel, you have grown up in a multiracial, multi-ethnic home. You've gone to a school where you have lots of international classmates. And so there's so much there because you're right. Most of us are not going to have the opportunity to have all the things that you've already experienced, particularly at such a young age. And so I think this maybe leads me really naturally into the next question that I wanted to ask you. And, you talked about intentionally branching out to meet people outside of your usual circles. And I'm curious, just based on everywhere from when you were a child to where you are today in life, how have you approached this and what have you been able to learn from some of those connections that you've made?
Well, I think again, I think a few buckets of my social life that really kind of brought out the confidence to do something like that, right? Not everybody, like one, recognizing that I was lucky enough to have the privilege to be able to go to the schools that I went to, been able to travel, but also been able to develop self confidence, mostly, I think, through sports and learning, how to connect with folks while being on teams. I mean, you named it. I played that sport more specifically, soccer, baseball, tennis, swimming, basketball, but also sports that were really male dominated, like hockey. I played roller and ice hockey and was the only non-male that was doing it at the time. And, snowboarding and skateboarding and, all those kind of more, some folks might say like, I don't know if it was aggressive or, more dangerous, but I participated in all of those. And through that, you find connections with all kinds of folks. And I think through understanding how to connect as a team, how to communicate with people from all different backgrounds to come together to find common goals as a team just kind of really gave me the confidence to, my next level of that is, traveling around the world and trying to learn from others. I think back about when I was in school, college, I should say, I went to the State University of New York. I went to the SUNY Purchase campus and I actually went to film school, which is really another kind of life that I've lived, Um, but I had this idea because I would travel a lot and I would meet so many people at, the airport and, specifically at airport restaurants or at airport lounges or bars. And I always wanted to sit at the bar specifically because that's typically where you have individuals that are there just, on their computer. And a lot of folks like to have conversations. So you sit next to somebody, hey, where are you going? Are you delayed? And through that, then getting into the conversation of, oh, well, where are you from? What's your experience? And so on and so forth. And the reason why I mentioned film school was I actually wanted to do a documentary film on that, on like people who you will encounter on a happenstance, whether it's a 5 minute or 45-minute conversation at an airport lounge or bar or restaurant. And just the, fascinating conversations and personalities that you meet along the way. And unfortunately, 9/11 happened and it completely changed how, the security and just how things are operated in the country, and especially at airports. And so that kind of faded out. But I still, I guess I kind of, in my own way, still did do that approach just without the cameras.
I absolutely love that you shared that story because I am someone who has been obsessed for years with humans of New York. You know, we're both from the New York area, but what was so wonderful to me about that, and I think very similar to what you just expressed, is I believe everybody has a story. And so I want to hear people's stories. And I guess this podcast in a way is my own way of bringing forth people's stories. And so I didn't realize we shared that in common as well. But it's not too late. I love this as an idea.
I just think it's so fascinating. Like there's just so many different types of people that you meet. And then I think, it's so cool to learn from their perspective. Like if I was going to Thailand or if I was going to London or South Africa, folks would be like, oh yeah, I've been there. I've never been there. Here's what just that kind of thing, striking up conversation and getting advice and, yeah, to just really wild personalities too. I mean, stories go on.
And I think it kind of ties back into what you said at the beginning, where, you are able to lean into difference, but not be afraid of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's so critical because so many of us today, we're afraid to just talk to anyone. I mean, even your neighbors,
right.
If you ask people, like, do you know who lives on your block? And I'm guilty at times of this as well. I know some of the people that live on my block, but not all of them.
I think I really give credit to, I think definitely to my family, to my parents. My dad was a very successful business consultant in the 80s and 90s. And he was a strategic manager. He came in and basically would talk and listen. Like that was he would talk and listen. And he really was a relational people person. And I really feel like I got the best of both worlds with my parents in terms of getting my dad's amazing, active listening skills, patience. He is very much someone who leads in the curiosity and, will lead with a question in terms of like wanting to understand more versus like challenging you, if that makes sense, right? So he really leaned into curiosity versus like, this is right, this is wrong. Right? He was not a either or thinker at all. And then on the flip side with my mom, she was an educator. She worked with various students throughout her years. And I actually, during college, I was a paraprofessional at her school starting at 18. And I was working at a school with youth with specialized needs, varying from all across, whether it's behavioral needs or learning disabilities, et cetera. And so just the combination of them really were the most patient, accepting, curious people who empowered me to be the same. And I really appreciated that. And so that I feel like really that anchored me in that and going to the United Nations International School, not being afraid of difference and wanting to learn and grow with others. And, I think that really just paved the way for, I think, who I am today.
Yeah. You just touched on something that I think is really interesting because I haven't had anyone else talk about this specifically, but because you went to the United Nations school, this obviously shaped how you interact with people. I'm curious, based on your experience in attending the United Nations school as a young person, what it has meant to you. You talked a little bit about like how you were willing to connect with people, but like, how do you think it continued to shape your approach to engaging with other people from different cultural backgrounds?
The experience is, and I'm going to go very stereotypical here, right? Because and like stereotypical in terms of how the United States paints high school and middle school, right? So typically what we quote unquote see if you go to like the cafeteria during lunchtime is social pockets, social groupings based on affinity spaces, right? So you'll see possibly quote unquote the jocks and the cheerleaders and the popular kids and the science kids and the theater kids and the musical kids, right? And they all have affinity spaces with one another, but they're separate. And that we see in a lot of these high school movies that everyone is in their own groups and you don't blend with one another. But if you do blend with one another, that there's opposition. And then typically in, these movies or the archetype is ideally, through opposition, you get to know one another. And then, we actually have commonalities and we actually can unite. And these two, distinct separate groups can actually be one group. And so what I found in going to the United Nations school was like, that was kind of it. We had so many people from, I mean, out of the, depending, I don't know where we're at now, I think about 120 countries, 119 countries around the world, there would be anywhere from 100 to 110 representation of of all those different countries going to that school simultaneously. And so it almost, in a way, I don't want to use the word forced, but you were just vast difference of culture and identities and people were all together in very small spaces. And in terms of small spaces, it was a private school. So my class, for example, my graduating class was, I want to say 82 or 85 people. So you're in very small spaces with folks that you might have been in school with from kindergarten. I entered in fifth grade and went through high school. And just you would be in a classroom with, 15, 20 people from all different countries. And so you didn't have necessarily that kind of affinity space right off the bat. And so you really had to get to know the individual and who did you want to hang out with based on who they were, not necessarily a type, like a stereotype, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I'm wondering like what that feels like, because I've not had that type of exposure myself, but I love the idea of it not being based again on affinity. And oftentimes we do come together in friend groups, both as kids and as adults, because there is something that we share in common, right? There's a reason that you've decided to gather. We have adult book clubs, or people that I'm even thinking about, like we had a Comic-Con not too long ago in the area, right? Like there are reasons that people choose to gather based on a shared interest. But Jo, I'm wondering also, you've had this amazing opportunity, and many people are not going to be able to send their kids to schools
Right.
like this. And so what would you say maybe to another parent who's hoping to broaden their child's own access to culturally diverse groups? And I ask that because I've had some recent conversations with some colleagues, and I have a particular person in mind right now, white woman, who is raising their child, and definitely said, like, I am trying my best to make sure that this child like is exposed to as much as they possibly can in terms of people, activities, etc. And so what would you offer, if you were talking directly to her, what would you say?
I think what I'd offer is, start where it's accessible. So I'm thinking museums, movies, the theater. And when I say accessible, in terms of accessible where, if those places aren't accessible for folks, I would look into public websites, like we have OPB, the Oregon Public Radio. So any kind of, I would say, getting a perspective that is as best as possible, not a biased perspective, if you will, because some, depending on where you go, it could come with a very biased lens. So just being mindful of that. That's why I say museums or various exhibits. And as folks get more and more familiar, and maybe, then if there's an opportunity to possibly join a group or find locations where you might have more access to difference in cultures, in community, in identities. But I think the most important thing when you're doing that is to be mindful, because like if you're trying to get exposure to, let's say, I don't know, a Hispanic population of folks, New York City is great. You have a high Puerto Rican population, many types of populations, but a very high Puerto Rican one, right? There's even Spanish Harlem, as an example. And if you decide to go into those neighborhoods to get more exposure, just also be respectful and mindful, right? Like you don't want to be kind of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Person who does unintended harm, right? And just like showing up and asking a bunch of questions, right? That would seem a little invasive and or inappropriate,
Yeah.
which is why I say kind of start with the places that are accessible for everybody. And as you're leaning into the culture, you can, getting books, literature, etc. Travel's a big one, but like you said, not everyone has access to that. But if there's pockets of places where you could eventually have a conversation with respect to let that person invite you in first, right? We want to be mindful that we're not imposing ourselves inappropriately at the extent of my learning against at the expense of someone else.
Yeah, I definitely have a deep appreciation of that because we don't want to be extractive when we walk into communities and it's just like, well, here, I'm here. Teach me all about your culture, And there are a couple of things that you just said that are just standing out to me in this moment. The first is around this accessibility. And I do want people to understand there are plenty of places that we can go for free and take advantage of the various resources that exist. So you mentioned the museums, there are libraries, which I'm a big proponent of. There are local festivals. So even if your town doesn't have a whole lot going on, there are places that we can still continue to tap into that are going to have a decent amount of cultural diversity, again, whether it happens to be a book, a film, or some activity that you can participate in. But the other thing that you said that really stood out, and I think I'm particularly sensitive to it, just given sort of where we are right now in this nation, is understanding that when you walk into these spaces, because I had a experience not too long ago, I guess it was during COVID, actually. I went to a museum and I had taken my daughter, and as we're walking through the museum, it dawned on me, like as I'm looking at the exhibits, I was like, I wonder who
Mhm.
curated this. Now, I'm not going to name the museum. We will not name the guilty party here. But what was explicitly clear to me is that it had a particular lens. I was like, oh, I am seeing a piece of history. I was like, but because I am someone who is very interested in culture, interested in history, I was like, I am also seeing a very clear absence of perspective here. And so being able to walk in those spaces, acknowledge, and quite frankly, still learn from what you're seeing, but understanding it may not be the complete picture, right? So how do we then go back into these spaces like other museums or libraries, pick up a different book, watch a different film, have a different conversation so that you can continue to build, because we never ever hear the complete story to anything. If anything, like I'm trying to get people to a more complete version of the truth.
I appreciate that so much. And I think that's why when I say, find uh, shows, find the art galleries that are not necessarily the big ones, right? Find the ones where it's an art gallery for the people, by the people, if you will, right? So, for example, we have an art gallery here in Portland that is amazing. They are run by queer and BIPOC, LGBTQ plus, trans, queer. So their lens is going to uplift other BIPOC. And when we say BIPOC, that stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And they really curate for the people who are part of that circle. And so their art is going to look very different than another art exhibit. And I think that's the thing, is when I say, how do you get exposure from the people who are part of that community, right? And so making sure, like, if we're seeing something from I'm trying to think of an artist that folks might know. Oh, Keith Haring, right? Keith Haring. There actually was a great exhibit with Keith Haring, who was a very well known gay artist out of the 80s in New York. I would love to see that from his perspective versus, curator necessarily. And so just being mindful of, when you're seeing the art, how is it being displayed? How is it being explained? How is it being demonstrated? And who's that lens coming from? Because if it's not coming from the artists themselves or from folks of that similar community, you're gonna get a different story. And so that's why I think it's really important that you, like anything else, you kind of check your sources, if you will, or go to multiple types of exhibits, not just the MoMA, not just, Met, the Met, for example. Go to the smaller galleries where the folks who are putting together the shows are folks from within that community.
Mm-hmm. I love that as an idea, just because I have had some of the best experiences popping into the random museum you didn't even know existed. It's like literally someone's home, and they started to aggregate things over the years, and they care about, I'm not going to say the larger museums don't care, because they absolutely do, but there's something about being able to hear that personal interpretation by, like, it's a one room schoolhouse and this is the person who grew up and maybe their family members went there some decades ago, and it's living history. And so I do like to be able to hear those stories. It makes it much more personal, and not to mention you get those little one-off comments from them that you would just never. I was in Myrtle Beach last summer, and we had a chance to, and I really am thinking about a one-room schoolhouse, visit a a school down there that was run, and this person who's now running the museum, literally his family went there from the time that it was open. And so there was so much history and so much just background on the local community that was offered that I would have never gotten by reading like a placard at the museum. It was not going to be able to fill those blanks in for me. So that sounds a whole lot of fun. I'm gonna take us broader now, because you mentioned that you love to be able to travel, right? So you've traveled internationally, domestically, and I am curious from your perspective, like how that's also shaped the way that you understand and relate to different cultural identities, because you've said specifically, like, you don't want people to be extractive. So what does that mean for you as you walk through the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, being mindful, and even, and I always say this in any workshop that I'm engaging in, or if I'm, working amongst a group of folks, as mindful as you will want to be, as much research as you might do to learn about culture and values that are different than yours. If you actually get the opportunity to speak with someone with a background that's different than yours, or travel someplace that is out of your country or even out of your town, because there is lots of cultural differences in the United States, from California to Chicago to New York to Florida to Texas to Wyoming, right? Like, even though we're part of the United States, there is a lot of cultural differences within all those states, right? And versus, city and urban and suburban, etc. So I always say that no matter how much preparation you can have, where you're going to learn the most is through your mistakes. And so
Say that again one more time, Jo. That's important.
I have learned the most through the mistakes that I've made, whether I've offended somebody, whether I wore the wrong thing, whether I presented something that was not a concept that culture, that person has heard of before, and they wanted to understand more, but also were shocked by it. And, having really courageous and difficult conversations, but you're really only going to learn through mistakes. And I've definitely had a few. So.
Yeah, you have no idea. I'm like laughing on this end because I don't know if you remember this moment, but I made a mistake in front of you. And so this is, gosh, we're going back some years now, and we were facilitating a training together. And in my haste to be inclusive to the audience, I had asked people to list out their preferred pronouns. You remember this day that this happened? And yeah, so I said to the audience, I was like, please, include your preferred pronouns so that we know how to refer to you. And what happened is you let that time pass, but I remember we had taken a break during the training, and you came back to me, and we were just doing our normal check-in like we would to make sure everything was still flowing. And you were like, I need you to be careful around this usage of preferred pronouns. And the reason that you said that you need to be careful about that is because they're not preferred. These are the pronouns of the people. And I so appreciated that in that moment, because for me, that was like this opportunity that, again, it didn't dawn on me, right? This is not my lived experience. And the carelessness of which I uttered those words, I'm like, that can land on someone differently. And so I both appreciated you being able to correct me in the moment, or I should say not in the moment, because it was behind the scenes. But what it allowed me to do then is when I came back online, and so this is happening on Zoom, when I came back online, I used it as a teachable moment. And I said to the audience, and I was like, I realized this is something that I said, and here's how I was wrong. Here's something I am newly learning, and I want to make sure that we all have the benefit of growing from as a result. And so like that was a gift to me in that moment, because you did it again so carefully. And so like it was just like, hey, just like anything else, what are we doing for lunch today? Oh, please don't use preferred pronouns, right? And we're going to lunch at 12. And so I love that you were able to do that. But for me, that was really important. So I learned from my mistake in that moment. I've not done that again, because I think it's one thing to learn from the mistake, and it's another thing to keep repeating it over and over again.
Right. And I mean, that's exactly that, right? This is another thing that I think we as people of the United States do a lot, is getting defensive when correction happens. And how can we, instead of saying, no, 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 I didn't mean it like that, be like, oh, thank you. And really like be receptive to that information so that it becomes that teachable moment, that aha moment where, we can say, wow, that is really good to know. I wouldn't have known that otherwise because, I remember an old supervisor of mine, one of my favorites. One of the things that she said to me was, people don't know what they don't know. And it's such a simple comp statement, but like it's so true because I think we get wrapped up because this country in particular is so individualized that we think everybody thinks like this or like this is my point of view and that point of view is a point of view of everyone else. I don't know how to explain. I don't know if I'm explaining that correctly, but I just feel that we're so, and again, this is a general kind of, I would say, how I perceive dominant culture here through my own lens of like the environment I grew up in, education, workplaces, etc. That we are a very individualistic society. We're actually number one in the world is of individualism is the United States. And so because of that, we have this, everything's like centered on you and you don't realize that everyone else, it might be they're centered on something else. Like we kind of miss that. And so I just appreciate that you're someone who is like, like, let me take that in. Let me like realize the impacts. And then how do I correct without feeling shame? And then, you said yourself, that is something that you remember to do moving forward. And that's kind of like when I interact with folks everywhere, it's like, thank you. Thank you for the learnings. Thank you for the teachings. I will hold myself accountable too. And, and then you can, as long as you can get over that, it's amazing how what you can see and learn.
It is interesting that you even bring up like the word shame, because I think that is absolutely what happens to people. We don't like to be vulnerable. We don't want to be wrong. But, if we think about childhood, right, that's how we learn things. Like a kid can't walk, they can't ride a bike out the gate. Like these are things that they have to progress and build their skill sets up. And so when I think about curiosity, when I think about culture, literally we are building stepping stones so that every day that you learn something, you incorporate that in. Tomorrow you learn something new, you get stronger, smarter, better, but it's not going to happen just out the gate, right? There are processes that need to play out. And from a shame perspective, like I'm just grateful when people want to share their knowledge with me because you don't have to. And so I take that as a gift each and every time I do learn something new from someone. And then, you touched on this idea also of individualism. Now, I spend a lot of time doing work because I run assessments, particularly on this. One of the assessments I use is called the IDI, or the Intercultural Development Inventory. And this idea of us wanting to minimize away difference is a big challenge for us. And so you kind of explained it as like you see it through your lens and you don't understand that someone else is also sort of tracking maybe in a different way. And I'm seeing that like left and right. It's like, well, you're supposed to know this. Or of course, this is the way that we do this. And I'm like that, but it's not how we all do it. And so I'm wanting for people right now, particularly in this space that we're in, right, to really dig into difference. But when I say that, like difference doesn't have to mean bad. I'm not saying look at the difference to judge it. I'm saying look at the difference to understand it. Because at the end of the day, there are things that matter to you as an individual, to me, to the next person. And I really want us to be able to focus on some level on those things. Sure, we have some common things. We always will. But it's those differences that will matter to us as individuals. Like, can you see me in my entirety? Or are you only looking for the things that you can say, oh, yeah, we both went to this school, or we both grew up in New York, or whatever it happens to be?
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate you bringing up the IDI because I did one of the workshops with you and Wendy, and I got to do my IDI and you helped, coached me through my results. I kind of, at the time, was someone who landed in a space where I was leaning into curiosity, but my major, I don't know what I'm looking for, my major, like my foundation was finding commonalities to learn about folks, but you got to go beyond that because you might not necessarily find those commonalities, but how do you still learn and grow? And so I really, part of my homework was leaning into how can we get to a place where we're asking questions and adapting and, understanding various folks from various backgrounds, but not necessarily with curiosity and not just being stuck in that, well, how does it relate to me? Because that's the thing, right? It's not about how does it relate to me. It's about me wanting to really understand and embrace who you are without it relating to me. Like just understanding who you are and being appreciative of your culture or your values or your what have you, even if it's different. And so that's what I've been working on. I think it's been like a year and a half or maybe 2 years since I had that. So that I feel like that has been something that I've intentionally been working on is it's not about me whatsoever. And how can we learn more about you and your impacts and like how you move about the space?
I am absolutely loving that you said that because you're unlocking something new in my brain, like as I'm listening to you, because you're absolutely right. Like we do make it about us. I just finished listening to a book this morning where the woman was talking about apologies and how even in apologies, we make it about us. I hope you'll forgive me. That's not about the other person, right? About the impact that you had on them, but it is about how you want to feel when everything's said and done. And so I just love that as a reference point because now I'm going to have to sit and think a little bit more about what you just shared because I'm like, where am I showing up in that way? And so I mention that even now because I think both of us are similar in the sense that we will take these new noticings and be like, wait, but does that apply to me? And so as you're thinking about it, it's one thing to learn from mistakes, but sometimes it's not even a mistake. It's just a shift in perspective. And it's like, oh, I hadn't considered that before. So maybe there's a different level of impact that can be here. So Jo, I kind of want to just stick on this question of travel for a second. While we were chatting and getting ready for this call, you mentioned being in Mexico. Yes. And in particular, you had talked a little bit about how people interacted differently with you than they did with your partner. And so I definitely wanted to come back to this and hear a little bit more about how you viewed your gender identity in that moment and how it might have influenced the interactions you had with people.
Oh my gosh. So this was the first international trip I was able to take since COVID of 2020. So my partner and I went to Mexico this past fall and got to spend a good, I think, 11 days. We were going up and down the Yucatan Peninsula. So we're talking about the east coast of Mexico, flying into Cancun. We went from Puerto Vallarta all the way down to Bacalar, which is pretty much more or less the southern tip of Mexico. It's about 30 minutes from Belize. So just giving folks a kind of painting a picture of how long and how far we went from north to south. And, visited many different towns along the way. And what I found so fascinating was, because I've noticed this before. So for folks, because you might not, I think this is going to be an audio podcast. We're not going to see each other. But so I am a more masculine presenting person. So there is some noticeable differences in my body than other assigned female at birth bodies. But at the same time, my voice is my voice. I have a more feminized face. The country of Mexico is known to be one that is a little more, what's the word I'm looking for, masculine in terms of men kind of take the lead, right? Females are more submissive kind of country. And I've experienced that before, just even having that more masculine look when I was with another partner, my ex from the past. They would talk to me, which was always so every time we had conversation, folks were, from Mexico were really all eyes on me, wanting me to engage with me. I'm the person that they're talking to. And I found this really fascinating because even though my background is I'm Latinx, I'm West African, indigenous, and I should speak Spanish, but I don't. That's another story. My partners knew how to speak Spanish, but I didn't. Yet they were all the focus and attention was on me. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I was more masculine presenting. I was, I'm brown and black. I do look, especially after, getting a little bit more tan, I do look like I'm someone native to the, more or less that area. More so than my partner, who is, white and from the Pacific Northwest. So you can imagine the skin tone difference. And I just found it very fascinating, though, that the person who could speak to them fluently in their language of Spanish, they would not connect with them. That everything had to be kind of in this triangle where they would be speaking to me. I could only understand so much, and I definitely couldn't speak what I wanted to say to them in Spanish. So then my partner would be speaking to them, and they would be giving eye contact and talking to them, but that person would almost never look at them. That they would then speak to me, and so there was this kind of triangle game of who's speaking to who and how are we communicating what and navigating all this, because I was, very masculine presenting and am masculine presenting as compared to my partners.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. What that surfaces for me though is this big question of like, how do we handle ourselves when we bump up against cultural norms that are
Mm.
not our own, right? So it's not that in Mexico the way that male and female traditional roles are set up are wrong. It is simply that is what they do there, right? And so the gender dynamics, one could say some of it translates to what we do here, but not completely. I think there's more of a culture of machismo for sure in Mexico. But like, how do you navigate that when it's not only just bumping up against the norm, but it may be something that's challenging to your own value system, right? Like, so if you're expecting that your partner should also be able to engage in this conversation, like, look, we're equal at home. And so I expect that we should be equal when we
Right.
come to Mexico. How'd you handle that? And like, what advice do you give people who are trying to
Well, I think,
navigate that?
it goes back to we're visiting them. We're visiting their place. And so first and foremost, being respectful of what their cultural norms are and not opposing them, but instead wanting to lean in and understand and embrace. So never during any interactions with anybody that we would interact with, and we would interact with a lot of folks because I'm a chatty catty. Like I just want to talk to everybody, right? So we're walking down the street. Hey, how's it going? They're trying to call you in. Hey, buy this tequila. I don't want to buy the tequila. I just want to get to know you. But I'll take a sip or two. But you know what I mean? Like, tell me more. Like, let me know about you, and maybe I'll have a shot with you. You know what I mean? But like, I don't. I just want to get to know you and what. And so being mindful that if that is the cultural norm, to not what's the word I'm looking for? I think it's okay to ask and like, oh, like, but be mindful. Like, never once during these conversations when I noticed that everyone was really paying, like, talking to me or being attentive to me and not my partner, I never once said, "Hey, they're the person who's talking to you. Can you talk to them?" Because that's again, we've got to be respectful of those cultural norms and pick up on those social cues. But the best thing that I can do is then afterwards check in with my partner. How did that feel for you? Are you okay? Do you understand why, this is the dynamic? Which they did, because they lived in Ecuador for like half a year. And I think it goes to, if you can get to know that person within those conversations just a little bit, then maybe you can just open up that question of, hey, like, I'm just wondering why, XYZ, or I don't know. I have a question. I have a wondering. I'm interested in,
Mm-hmm.
but being that I'm interested in understanding, not, I don't appreciate you not talking to the person who's talking to you,
Yeah.
you know,
So more curiosity focused, less judgment.
100%, 100%.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. And it's interesting because I've also seen that like play out here in the States as well. Like I have a memory of I was dating someone at the time and I was house shopping. And one of my neighbors at the time was a real estate agent. And I had said to him at one point in passing, I'm looking to buy a house and could we maybe talk? And it just happened to be that he was outside one day when my partner was there. And he was like, "Oh, I know that you're looking to buy a house," and turned immediately to my partner
Right.
and started the conversation. And I just found it ironic because, again, like it's definitely a crossover from like perhaps the culture that you just expressed, in Mexico. But it was interesting to me because I'm not with that person anymore. I have a house because, as I said, I was interested in
That's
buying
right.
that house. But it was, I do think that there's something, and I wasn't at a place in my life just yet where I was ready to ask that deeper question, right? Tell me a little bit more about your thought process. And I almost wish I could go back and have that conversation, because it's not that he was right or wrong. Like, that's how he was raised and that was his
Exactly.
perspective of the world. But for me, the downside of it is because he did not address me, he lost any sale that he would
Yeah.
have gotten through
Yeah.
me, because I felt like I was unimportant and not significant to this, although I told him I was purchasing the house. So I think there are lots of opportunities to learn, both when we're in different people's cultural spaces internationally, but also I think even at home. So when we're talking about gender roles, when we're talking about racial or ethnic groups or religious groups, if you don't belong to that cultural group, there are nuances within that culture you're just not going to understand. So like, how do we broaden the conversation to be able to take in more
Yeah.
information? So, Jo, we're coming to the end of our time together. So I want to just follow up and ask, are there any new projects or things that you're looking forward to on the horizon? How can people connect with you? Tell us what you have
Yeah,
going on.
I love to connect with folks, whether it's a conversation, whether it's, wanting to collaborate on a project or an idea. I I would love to connect with anyone who is interested in just being a thought partner, up to a co-facilitator in collaborating on a project that you might be working on that is centered around LGBTQ plus inclusion and support, or any kind of racial work that needs to happen, maybe in a workplace where folks are trying to be more inclusive to all kinds of backgrounds. But again, my name is Jo Xavier Doyle. I'm out of the Portland metro area, and you can find me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's always a pleasure to just sit down and chat with you. I feel like we have fun. We laugh a
I
lot
didn't
when
know
we
how much
get
I could
together, and
laugh,
that is
and
fun.
I didn't want to mess with the sound.
I want you to laugh because, this is, yes, it's a serious business that we're talking about. And I want to be able to bring joy and levity to this work. This does not have to be, to your point earlier, right? It's not scary. We can have fun. We get to meet wonderful people who are not exactly like us. And it is a beautiful place to be. Is there anything else that you just want to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
I just want to highlight and uplift that while I'm super appreciative of my agency, I do want to make a distinction that this interview today is completely separate of, and I am not a spokesperson to my agency that I work for in today in this interview. That everything that is said here is based off of my experience in my life and has nothing to do with the work that I do with the agency.
Jo, thank you again so much for the laughs, for the wisdom, for everything, for your friendship. It means a great deal for me to be able to just, again, interact with you and learn from you and have joy when we get together. So I wish you the best 2025, and we will talk soon.
That's good. Always a pleasure, Danielle. You have been doing incredible work, and I really appreciate you uplifting the importance of curiosity. It's a game changer if folks can lean into curiosity and not be scared of difference. It really, really can be a game changer for folks.
I love all the insights and reflections that we had a chance to touch on today. Every time I speak with Jo, I gain fresh perspectives, and I hope this episode sparked new ways of thinking for you as well. One of the biggest takeaways from today's episode is that curiosity isn't just about finding common ground. It's about being open to what makes us different. Whether we're engaging in conversations across cultures, navigating gender identity in new spaces, or unlearning biases, we grow the most when we're willing to make mistakes and learn from them. So here's an action step for you. Think about a time when you hesitated to ask a question or engage in a conversation because you were afraid of getting it wrong. What would it look like to lean into curiosity instead of fear in that moment? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to connect with me on social media or leave a review. It truly helps to bring these conversations to more people who need them. Until next time, remember, curiosity is a practice, and where curiosity leads, connection grows. Be well, everyone.